Roush Fenway Racing. You could easily say this is the NASCAR equivalent of the Boston Red Sox. After all, Red Sox owner John Henry bought a 50% stake in the team back in 2007. But their methodology in terms of drivers equals to the modern-day Oakland Athletics. Matt Kenseth, Greg Biffle, and Carl Edwards were all homegrown superstars. The early 2010s also saw success from David Reagan, Ricky Stenhouse Jr., and Trevor Bayne, guys that went under the radar and became winners driving their Ford Fusions. Colin Braun was another in-house talent of that era. He had a very diverse racing background and had worked his way into the NASCAR level. But compared to his other Roush teammates, Colin Braun never exactly found that success that some of the other homegrown superstars did. So therefore, it's time to flip the ignition and look at the disappearance of Colin Braun and what has happened to the NASCAR prospects since. The racing journey for Colin Braun started at just the young age of 6. He raced quarter midget cars and eventually upgraded to kart racing. This enterprise wasn't exactly on native soil as he raced across the world in the likes of Monaco, Spain, France, and Japan. At 17, Braun became the youngest driver ever to start a Daytona prototype race. That's insane because most 17-year-old kids today don't even have a valid driver's license. Meanwhile, Colin Braun is out here muscling sports cars in the grueling Rolex 24. Competing in 29 events, Braun would win 2 races a part of the starting rotation, along with 11 podium finishes. In that same year, Braun would officially cross paths with the cat in the hat of the NASCAR Cup Series, Jack Roush. He would sign a developmental contract and race Ford Fusion stock cars beginning with the ARCA Remax series. In his first race, it was in the Gateway City, and he actually did very well, finishing a respectable 9th place, and he did a great job keeping it off the wall and keeping it clean. Then driving up north on I-55, Braun collected his first top 5 after finishing 3rd in the Windy City. His final stats line wasn't bad for a guy with no stock car experience. I mean, he completed 100% of the laps and he didn't ruffle any fenders. That prowess led to NASCAR baptism by fire. Trucks at Martinsville, where his 50 Ford F-150 DNF'd and finished 34th. As the 2007 NASCAR campaign ended in Homestead, Colin Braun would get his big break lined up for the upcoming season in 2008. He would replace past truck champion Travis Quaffle and would drive the number 6 Ford F-150, a part of Roush's truck program. Conway Freight would put up big money, and they would end up plastering their logo on the hood for all 25 races. But of course, sponsorship only grants you those opportunities. It would take a good group of people to work around Colin Braun and help him develop into a top NASCAR driver. The guy a part of the challenge would be the crafty Mike Beam, a crew chief that carried over 2 decades of expertise in the field, working with the likes of Kyle Petty, Bill Elliott, and recently, Mark Martin. But most importantly, just a few short years ago, he had the task of developing David Reagan in the pipeline. And in his 9 races working with the Georgia native, he earned 6 top 10s and led a good amount of laps. Jack Roush felt this was the guy to grow and develop their young talent. And considering the successes of Roush's truck program, he was expected to win a race or 2 and be an outside contender for the truck championship. On the track, those expectations were met with grave disappointment. To sum things up, Colin Braun and Mike Beam struggled to adapt to the seasoned veterans of the series, as Braun went the entire rookie season without back-to-back top 10 finishes. One race he would get a solid top 10 finish, and then the next he'd finish well outside the top 15 or even wreck the truck. The 6 team, quite frankly, they were a mid-pack team, which shows as they finished in the mid-teens in the final NASCAR truck driver standings. And Kyle Busch, who ran 7 less races, was only 2 points from dethroning him from the 13th position. If there was one positive to look at, it was definitely with David Reagan. Despite having minimal NASCAR experience, he was able to progress immensely in his sophomore season in Cup, and he almost made the 12-driver postseason. And definitely, this sparked some confidence, especially as Colin Braun, he barely has any experience either, and he could very well do the same and maybe even exceptionally better considering he has more time to develop in the lower divisions and get better and to start winning races. So eyeing that future, Jack Roush still kept faith, and Conway kept footing the bills for the number 6 team. Mike Beam and the 6 crew definitely came into the new season with a bit of experience, as they had some learning curves last year, and they had a little bit more speed now in their F-150s with an extended notebook. And that was showcased in the season opener. Colin Braun put a lap on top of the leaderboard and led 15 laps in the 200-mile race. That was more than his entire NASCAR sanctioned career combined. A top 10 finish made you think, this 6 team, they finally have it in gear, and they're going to start putting together consistent runs and knocking on the door of victory lane. Then came an absolutely brutal stretch of 4 crashes in 6 races. One of those came at Charlotte, where he led 43 laps and had a truck capable of racing with Ron Hornaday. Until Kyle Busch pulled at Arlington 2020 and took out the dominant truck of the night. 7 races into the season, he was an abysmal 19th place in points. When you're getting outpointed by Jason White in a Roush car, I hate to say it, but it's probably because of the driver behind the wheel. But as the calendar turned to June, the Conway Freight team started to ship out decent results. A consistent 3rd place for his Texas homecoming. That led to the 2009 running of the Michigan 200. As one of the only competitive Fords in the series, it was critical to put up a good outing for the automakers. His challenger was, once again, the new black hat of the lower divisions, the very driver that gave him heartbreak in the Queen City. So today was his time to beat the league's dominator and gain the support of Trigger Dale Jr. fans. And after going door to door with Kyle Busch battling for the lead, Colin Braun prevailed. 34 races of mediocrity and frustration, that was now all out the window. Colin Braun was a winner in the NASCAR Truck Series. That would spark an incredible Texas-sized second half. Colin Braun climbed from 19th in the standings and solidified a top 5 points finish by placing 3rd in the season-ending Ford 200. The self-improvement paid off to a great extent, which led to Jack Roush granting him a spot on his Xfinity roster. Conway Freight would move up and sponsor 18 of the 16 team's 35 races. And on the box now was Eddie Pardue, a staple of the Roush Xfinity program, winning races with the likes of Greg Biffle and Matt Kenseth. That was going to help Braun greatly in Xfinity. After all, he's had experience with Xfinity cars, he knows what the drivers want. And so many fans and experts felt that this was going to be a great year for Colin Braun and he was going to exceed expectations in Daytona. That wouldn't come to fruition as Braun struggled immensely adapting to the leech-infested competition of the Xfinity Series. And to start out his full-time Xfinity career, he had an absolutely abysmal stretch to start the season. 8 races, 5 DNFs. These were catastrophic numbers. Unless you're racing in your local demolition derby, as then completing 3 races, that would be really good, celebrated even. So following another crash at Talladega, Colin Braun ended up getting benched. The main reason was because Colin Braun was showing a lot of inexperience, as they did this with Ricky Stenhouse Jr. as well. So with the races where their young drivers didn't have any sponsorship, they pretty much just benched them. And I know, you guys are thinking, oh, Colin Braun's such a horrible driver in this point, definitely a bust. But honestly, it's hard to fault Braun himself for the poor performance. Roush Fenway Racing's Xfinity program expanded to include Paul Menard. That meant expansion to include more cars, engineers, and persona. Their Xfinity roster was pretty much Carl Edwards, 2 rookies, and a mediocre Menard. The 60 team, they were head and shoulders the superior team, and quite possibly they got the upper hand for the organization. And that was greatly showcased with their performance of the other 3 cars. Even Matt Kenseth couldn't get on the level as Carl Edwards in replacing Colin Braun, as he scored 2 top 10 finishes, but he never led any laps in his starts. But as the dog days of summer heated up, Roush Fenway was able to pick up the pace just a bit. Carl Edwards won more races, Paul Menard got more top 10s and climbed to 5th in points, and Ricky Stenhouse Jr. was the breakout star as he crashed less and got more consistent. Colin Braun, however, remained stagnated in his driver development. He only DNF'd 2 more races, which was better, but yet again he was still struggling to consistently string top 10s together, and oftentimes top 15s as well. And I think part of that was the result of Roush changing the crew chiefs and Braun sitting out a majority of the races that he didn't have a sponsor. He couldn't consistently learn, therefore he ended the season ranked 23rd in points with only one lap led on the season. And with barely any results and barely any full-time sponsorship, he was put on the hot seat entering the 2011 NASCAR silly season. So during the upcoming off-season, Roush Fenway Racing's Xfinity program restructured back to 3 cars after Paul Menard and his Menard sponsorship went to RCR. Conway Freight also left at season's end, and no plan was inscribed for Colin Braun. Jack Roush seemed more committed to finding sponsorship for Carl Edwards and Ricky Stenhouse Jr., as well as newcomer to the organization Trevor Bayne. So officially, on December 1st, 2010, Colin Braun was released from the organization, becoming a free agent in the series garage. Now ultimately, he would find some new employment, in the form of Billy Ballou's 51 truck. However, it was a part-time gig. He only got 2 races, one of which was the Michigan race 2 years after he bested Kyle Busch in that exact same equipment. Braun would finish 9th after 102 circuits in the Motor City. His final start was a 19th place finish in Atlanta, and as the Georgia sun faded into nightfall, so did the NASCAR career of Colin Braun. He never made another start for a NASCAR team, and eventually decided to step away from the sport in 2012. So what's happened to Colin Braun since? Believe it or not, compared to other failed prospects, he has succeeded pretty well outside of the NASCAR garage. Braun made a return to sports cars with Core Autosport, and contributed to 5 team victories from 2012 to 2013. Meanwhile, under the rebranded United Sports Car Championship, Braun returned to Core Autosport, in which he won the 2014 Rolex 24. In the rotating 54, Braun would win races at Sebring, Watkins Glen at Kansas, leading 32 laps in the latter event. He would go on to win the PC Championship both in 2014 and 2015 with this group, and has won 11 races and 13 podium finishes since the series rebrand. In terms of other opportunities, Colin Braun has expressed interest in IndyCar, and he even subbed for Sam Mayer during an ARCA race at the Daytona Road Course. It's hard to believe, but he's only 31 and he still has a great majority of his motorsports career in front of him. He could win more sports champs, possibly race some open wheel races, and just maybe he'll return to the NASCAR circuit. I mean, I can definitely see it, especially with the next gen car coming up. It could potentially work into Colin Braun's favor. In terms of his full-time NASCAR career, he disappeared for a variety of reasons. He never really started winning races right off the bat. The sponsorship disappeared, and there were a lot of struggles with Roush at the time. I feel like if he were to come up around, say, 2005, he probably would have had some success. After all, that was the era where Roush just started bringing up guys left and right, and I think Colin Braun would have been one of them. But unfortunately, Colin Braun is one of those names, at least on the NASCAR side, that just came and went. So anyways, this is NRF signing out. And just remember, life's a beach, and then you drive.